Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome once again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, what we like to call the greatest story ever told, or perhaps another way of putting it, the greatest story ever lived. And thank you again for joining us today. And please tell your friends if you like it and tell us what we could do better if you don't. Well, today we have the great honor of being able to talk to Pete Greig, who needs no introduction from me, I'm sure, but I will mention a few things about Pete. First of all, Pete is a best-selling author and pastor. He, according to his website, is the bewildered instigator of the 24/7 prayer movement, and that has reached more than half the nations on the earth. He's also senior pastor of Emmaus Road in Guildford, and he's written many, many books, including Red Moon Rising, God on Mute, The Prayer Course, Dirty Glory. The list could go on. But Pete, as I say, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about who you are. On top of that, what you're doing right now, and maybe how you come to be here right now, talking to me about Mark's Gospel.
Of course, Stefan, it's such a joy to be on your podcast. Thanks for having me. And thank you for the way that you've been just blazing a trail for, the primal gospel of Mark for all these years. And I think we first connected, through New Community Church, Southampton, and particularly we were on a similar journey from a sort of charismatic background into discovering the things of the contemplative life and meditation, spiritual direction, spiritual formation, and so on. And I remember you wrote a very good book about that. And so it's been exciting. Of course, what we've all done is come full circle and realized that the charismatic and contemplative, we weren't actually evolving from one thing to another. We were walking in a circle. They're the same thing. That's what we eventually discovered. But anyway, yes, exactly as you say, I'm the increasingly bewildered founder of the 24/7 prayer movement. I've been in a state of constant bewilderment for almost quarter of a century now, which is an impressive level of bemusement. And it's just extraordinary to see what God continues to do all around the world as we simply pray. Yes, it's a joy to be senior pastor of Emmaus Road Church in Guildford, Woking, Aldershot. It's very important, isn't it, to be rooted in actual community. At the moment you get on an aeroplane, you become an expert. It's quite tempting, but actually it's very important to, to be in a space that doesn't take you too seriously and where you can be yourself and make your contribution. And local church is the coalface. So, yeah, and Sammy and I have been married for about 300 years now. We have two grown-up sons and a little dog called Crumble. And we split our life between living on a riverboat on a barge, 60-foot long, 9-foot wide, on the River Way that runs right through Guildford, which is gorgeous most of the year and really hard in the winter. And then a cliff-top house on the Isle of Wight, which is where I'm speaking to you now.
Sounds absolutely brilliant, Pete. Thank you so much for letting us know a little bit more about who you are. I know our listeners are going to be fascinated by what you just said. So we're going to discuss a passage which is very famous in Mark's Gospel, the denial of Jesus by Peter, right at the end of chapter 14. And to read it for us before we have our conversation is our good friend Lucy Warner. So over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Mark chapter 14, verses 66 to 72, New International Version. Peter disowns Jesus. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said, but he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lucy, for that. Pete, when we've been discussing this passage just before we started recording, I know you had some wonderful things to say. I just wondered whether you could mention 1 or 2 of them right now at the beginning of the conversation.
Well, Mark, isn't it a fabulous story? I mean, I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think you've probably thought more about Mark's Gospel than anyone else in the country over recent years. So, I think for me, first and foremost, I'm trying to learn how to approach the scriptures and particularly the Gospels prayerfully, for conversation with the Lord rather than information or revelation about him. And so when I do that with this passage, there's lots of really interest. I'm a preacher. We can do the interesting points. I'm aware that some of your listeners, the Lord will have built them to find intimacy and process information very much through their brains, and so they will want the frontal cortex, the part of the brain that's about logic and language and so on, to be engaged. But actually, it is cinematic, isn't it? There's such texture to this story that little detail. I can almost imagine the cameras sort of panning down because this is below the courtyard, and then the fire burning. Of course, you're hearing it and you're smelling it and you're feeling the warmth of it, and we get the proximity of Peter, so that the light playing on his face, and then if you were scripting this, it's extraordinary, the way that the servant girl first speaks to Peter, then she speaks to the crowd about Peter, and then the crowd speak to him. So we get drawn into the feelings and the emotion of this story in the most extraordinary way. And I'd love to know from you. I mean, is that because, do you buy into the thing that Peter's the source of all of this, and this is him almost having a therapy session as Mark's writing it out? What's going on here?
It could very well be. I do definitely buy into the idea that Peter is a source for Mark. But I think for me, Mark is someone who is not just the person who takes down notes and then replicates them. He's done some thinking about it as well, and he organizes his material. But I do take the point that Peter's character, his emotions, all those things, and the vividness of his experience come through remarkably here, don't they? I think I love the idea of being like a cinema. And obviously Mark didn't know anything about cinemas, but I think I'm wondering, as a storyteller myself, whether Mark does construct this particular part of his story with a storyteller in mind. And the whole gospel would be read by a storyteller, and there would be a dramatic element to that reading. So I think that it's not an accident that this section here is just so dramatic and built in the way that you've suggested.
And it's important as well, isn't it? Because it's not a sort of standalone, like, some of Jesus' parables can feel a bit like that. And maybe Mark decided to, plot 2 or 3 of them together. There's a chronology here. There's a building tension, isn't there? It's a very long chapter. I know the chapters weren't in originally, but there's this sense of flow. And then there's so much symmetry here. When we were talking earlier, you were pointing out an earlier piece of symmetry, and I was zoning in on a latter piece of symmetry in another gospel. That interested me.
So should we talk about that? Maybe you talk about your latter piece of symmetry, first of all.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, it is so striking that you know, in John's Gospel, in John 21, we have that gorgeous story of the resurrected Christ cooking breakfast on the beach and so deliberately reinstating Peter with those three, you know, do you love me? You know, do you love me? Did you even like me? Those three, do you love me? And of course, it's on the third one that, I mean, you almost want a rooster to crow again to sort of drive it home, but it's so clear. You denied me 3 times. And, you know, my wife's a professional counselor. I think she would probably say this is pretty good therapy right now. And now I am reinstating you 3 times. Three confessions of no matter how much you deny Christ, keep loving Christ, and the love will ultimately displace the apostasy. So I'm very struck. And of course, John 21 is around a fire. Yeah. Now, we know Jesus, well, presumably Jesus somehow saw this, because he's up above, he's looking down. So that's quite a thought right there. And Peter, in his typical way, I so relate to this. He's so black and white. What people miss about this story is, why on earth has he gone to this courtyard?
Yes.
Some commentators say that was he planning to try and mount a guerrilla rescue of Jesus? Yeah. And were his lies really him just trying to cover up so he could, now there's zero evidence for that. But we do know it's sort of reflective of his personality. On one hand, the other disciples have just disappeared, very sensible. They've put some distance between themselves and all that's going on. Peter is probably closer physically to Jesus at this moment than any of the other disciples. So we give him a hard time, but he was there. Yeah. And yet when he's there, he's the one who then denies Jesus most forcefully. And I don't know about you, Stefan. I think you're probably much godlier than me, but I relate to this. On one hand, I'm Jesus's biggest fan. I'm like fully in, like I'm 24/7 for crying out loud. Yeah. And yet I know my own capacity to, live with extraordinary, failure and brokenness and denial. And so I kind of want to go and give Peter a big hug here. Yeah. And I think Jesus does too, because that's what he does on the beach in John 21. Yeah. But so that, to me, that's such a clear parallel. The fire, the 3 denials, it's beautiful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. And it really helps, I think, our listeners, it helps me to listen to you say about the fact that we are quite black and white in a sense. We swing backwards and forwards, don't we? We say we're passionately in love with Jesus, but there are these little denials all along the way, not even if we're talking about saying that we are Christian in public. It's more than that for me. I think our topsy-turvy life can be about saying no to Christ's invitations to do something, to behave in a certain way. We're so easily distracted away from that apparent loyalty to Christ that we profess, which we do profess sincerely, just like Peter. And I love what you said there. That's brilliant. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I was just adding an amen. I think I know I can be, in worship, hands aloft, giving it everything and questioning whether, the whole thing is true or not.
Yeah.
And people get shocked when I say that. And I don't know why, because, clearly we live in a world where many people question Christianity, and there's thinking people, we will sometimes do that. But equally, I remember when I was not a Christian, or trying to be not a Christian. I was terrible as a non-Christian. I was dreadful. I kept praying. It was so embarrassing to the God I didn't believe in. And one of the things I discovered then when I was desperately trying not to be a Christian is, I'd be down in the pub actually speaking, I didn't want any of my Christian friends to know, but actually arguing in favor of God to those. So I'm not a very good Christian, and I'm an even worse atheist. It's incredibly depressing. But I look at Peter and I think I recognize the psychosis. This is very familiar.
And maybe we can talk a bit later about, what this does reveal about Peter, in the sense of why does he reveal so much about himself if he indeed is the source of this story. You mentioned about the symmetry, though, earlier, and you said about my own thoughts on that. And I think it is worth mentioning that Mark often does this. This isn't the first time that Peter in the courtyard is mentioned. It's mentioned just before Jesus's trial scene in this chapter. So it's almost like Jesus's trial scenes in the middle of two references to Peter's story. And as you think about it, for me, it's pretty clear that these two stories, they're meant to be compared and contrasted. They kind of mirror one another. Mark has put them in this order deliberately. So you reflect on one and in contrast to the other. I mean, a similar idea is where you have the woman with the issue of blood and Jairus' daughter. You have Jairus approaching in chapter 5, and then the woman in blood touches Jesus's garment, is healed, and then you're back again with Jairus and the healing and
wow
of the daughter.
Wow. So that that's fascinating. So the low status person interrupts the very mission of God to the high state. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, no, there's plenty of things.
Now, so let me. I buy the thesis. You've convinced me. So tell me what that means. Talk to me about the what is Mark drawing our attention to by paralleling these two courtyard scenarios?
Well, I think that the main difference, if you like, the main contrast is the behavior of the two main characters, who are both of them on trial in one way or another. Jesus is honest in his answers. He says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. He is now most honest about who he is, his identity, in answer to the questions. Peter is completely renouncing his identity as a follower of Jesus. He's denying it. What's interesting about the two trial scenes as well is that the testimony against them in Jesus's trial, the testimony is false. All the accusations against him are false, but Jesus speaks the truth. In this instance, the woman, the servant girl, speaks the truth. You also were with that Jesus, the Nazarene, as do the others. But Peter's response is false. So there's a contrast being built between Jesus and Peter. And for me, that is a deliberate contrast, because Peter has been our focus all the way through this latter part of the gospel. And it makes us think about our own discipleship in exactly the same way we've been talking about already.
Yeah.
In terms of, are we prepared to go through to the bitter end, whatever that might be, like Jesus? Are we prepared, as in chapter 8, to take up our cross, to deny ourselves and follow him right to the end? Or are we not? Just before you come back, because I know I've done a lot of talking, I just want to say a bit about John's gospel and how you mentioned that kind of the redemption of Peter, actually, in mirroring this incident. I think there's some redemption going on even in the passage itself. You say that Peter followed, and you have to ask the question why, as you say. And you said rightly that he is the only one who does. And for me, that points to the fact that even this man, who not only says, I don't know him in a kind of, I just want to push off, I don't want to talk about it, he vehemently denies Jesus. He says, I do not know Jesus. I have nothing to do with him. It's an absolute calling down curses on himself, saying, send me to hell if I'm telling lies. He calls down curses on himself. It's a vehement denial. Nevertheless, he does follow at a distance. And right at the end, nevertheless, he breaks down and weeps. He knows, he realizes what he's done. So there's a sense that even in the moment of utter betrayal, there is chance, there's an opportunity for redemption.
Beautiful. It makes me, let me make a slightly provocative statement and then flesh it out so people aren't upset with me. I think we are increasingly in a culture that requires of its leaders perfection. And patently no one can make the grade. What if what we really required of our leaders was that they would be the people whose hearts were always seeking to get as close as possible to Jesus, which is what Peter's doing here. Yeah. And so let me flesh it out. Scenario one, last week, talking to a brilliant young man, who said to me, I've thought about going into full-time ministry in the church, but he said, I've decided not to because I don't think I can live the next 50 years without saying or doing something stupid. He said, I've come to the conclusion there's more grace if I go into the media or banking than there is in the church. Wow. Let me just pause for a second, because here's the thing that goes on in most of the listeners or viewers. They go, that's really sad, and they think it's probably true. How did we get to that place? That's scenario number one.
Yeah.
Scenario number two, I was sitting outside a pub by the river where the boat is recently with two leaders who've both messed up badly over recent years. And so the pints are out, and I say to them, well, you guys have both been on quite a journey. One of them instantly went, yeah. He said, but it's because I sinned. I made choices that were just sinful, and I brought enormous pain to my life, my family, and others. And actually, he's on the most extraordinary story of restoration, this guy. At that moment, my heart did not move away from him, it moved towards him. I think anyone that would want to almost hug him, there's something about that vulnerability, which we see in Peter in this story, that choice to own his own shadow, to confess his own sin, that actually increases trust and speaks to me of someone who is not far from Jesus, but close to him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, please, I want to just say really clearly, because I have a lot of people who say quite nasty things to me publicly and privately online. I'm not in any way trying to justify sin, or the damaging of people is anti-Christ. Please hear me. I spend a lot of my time helping victims, and I choose not to speak about it publicly, as unlike some people. Don't construe what I've just said as in any way justification of anything. But all I'm saying is I look at this passage and I look at Peter is he just was close to Christ. Even when he was messing up, his proximity to Christ seems to me to be one of the things that qualifies him to be a leader. So I'll leave it there.
That's fantastic. Wow. It's so gracious of you to mention that. I'm interested in the whole idea of leadership, actually, Pete. In this part of Mark's Gospel, we're talking about the second half, the bit after the bit I've just quoted, where Jesus says, if anyone is ashamed of me, in this adulterous and sinful generation, I'll be ashamed of him. And that's in chapter 8. And this is where Peter himself is exactly that. And the rest of the gospel from chapter 8 on to the end, it seems to me, one of the main themes is discipleship, but not just anyone's discipleship. It's a discipleship of leaders. It's the leaders of the church who are under the microscope, the future leaders, the apostles themselves, Peter in particular. And what you said at the beginning of that last comment about leadership as in some way being people expecting to be perfect in order to be leaders, or being expected to be perfect. It's just not credible. It's not even in the Bible. Here we have leaders who are flopping, actually. All the disciples, all the others, all the apostles have fled. Every single one of them, without exception, they've all denied Jesus. So there's something about Jesus's trust in these people who come out of at the end of this story as the leaders of the church that I think gives us, first of all, a cause for optimism, but also a sense that we too are susceptible, like these guys. If we're leaders, we have to accept that fact that we're human and we're not perfect.
Yeah,
we have to be aware
and
of the difficulties.
I mean, it's sort of. I mean, these are the moments that restore hope.
Yeah,
you know, but also make you fall in love with Jesus again.
Yeah,
don't they? You just, I mean, clearly Peter's affection for his Lord comes through in this story. We focus a lot on how honest and vulnerable and self-effacing he is, sharing in this gospel his own failures. It's an extraordinary thing to do. You think you're trying to be the rock, live up to the prophecy, build the church, encourage the saints, and it's just bad PR. I mean, you just don't share this stuff, but he does. But there's such a strong subtext here of, especially when we read it in the context, as you say, of the courtyard, the other courtyard scene, or John 21, as I've said, of the grace of Jesus. You get the sense it's not even that sort of in this moment, if he glimpsed it, he was angry, but he got over it. And by the time he's resurrected and really holy, he decided to forgive Peter. You get the sense that he'd already forgiven him. Like with the, this is working something outrageous with the text, but I'm into Lectio Divina, so in prayer I can go to all sorts of places with these passages, and it's fine. Just imagine a scenario where Jesus is somehow actually fully witnessing this encounter.
Yep.
And there are tears in his eyes. If it's a movie, you're seeing Peter's denial, you're just seeing Christ in the shadows on the balcony. I mean, this is totally not what happened, but and you feel the nail going in every time. Before Christ is crucified, his best friend, I don't even know him. You feel that, but in that moment, you can almost imagine Jesus saying, "But Peter, you love me. I don't even know him, but Peter, you love me." Imagine that.
Wow.
Days before the reinstatement, because his heart towards us is not forgiveness once we finally do the formulaic repentance thing.
Yeah.
His heart of forgiveness, like the prodigal father who is on tenterhooks watching for his son to return. We don't know for how long before the prodigal comes back. His heart is immediately to forgive, but repentance is simply the process by which we receive the embrace and begin the process of getting whole again. So, I mean, this is not very. Your Reformed listeners and viewers may not feel very happy with me here, but I just think there's something deeply relational going on here, and deeply human, and not formulaic in any way at all.
Yeah, I do take your point. I think my own prayer life in recent days has been focused on this idea of forgiveness. Christ dying on the cross was the moment where he forgave, as far as I'm concerned, right now. There was that moment when everything was forgiven. And yes, we do have to repent. Yes, we do have to come to our senses. But that forgiveness is there for us all, single one of us. And even in Mark's gospel, it says every sin will be forgiven, all except the one sin of blaspheming against the Holy Spirit, which we can talk about. We have talked about in another podcast. But there is that open door that Christ has presented for us, just willing to go through it.
Yeah. And that extraordinary sort of booby trap that the gospel writers put into the crucifixion narrative. you almost get the sense it was deliberately to stop anyone ever getting too religious about this moment, where, of course, I can't remember whether it's in Mark or not, but the thief on the cross, this day you'll be with me in paradise. And of course, he hasn't properly repented. He's not understood the creed. He's never been to church. He hasn't got baptized. And he's the first into the new dispensation. And he walks through pretty much holding the hem of Christ's garment. And, right there you have this great screaming statement. It's not by works. It is by the posture of one's heart. You don't have to understand it all. And I love that joke that Shane Claiborne tells about Peter's at the pearly gates with his clipboard checking people into heaven. And he's getting more and more cross because he says the numbers just don't tally up. And he says Jesus is the problem. He keeps letting people over the back wall. There's grace seeping through this passage, seeping through, as you say, the crucifixion narrative, and it makes me fall in love with Jesus all over again.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. I'm gonna just focus us away a little bit from the personal and the focus on Jesus's relationship with us, with all men and women everywhere. And it's probably what we've just discussed is probably the bit that people really, I would imagine, are going to be most blessed by when they listen to this podcast. I think it's amazing. It's going to be the most important bit. But I think for me, it's worth looking a little bit more deeply at the story itself in terms of the context Mark was writing in. And I think if you think of, a lot of this is speculation, but there is a certain amount of evidence to suggest that Mark was writing for a particular audience. And if we suggest that he was writing it about 70 AD, at the point where the Romans had destroyed the temple, and all sorts of things were going on. And it's likely that the Christians, those who belong to Christ, were under all sorts of pressures. One of them being actually the temptation to believe that in order to be a Christian, one also has to be a Jew, that the Gentiles in some way aren't included. And all through this gospel, as people listen to this podcast, you'll see this thread, I think. There's a sense of Christ's openness to all, Gentile and Jew, his willingness to embrace every single nation on the earth. That's God's plan for his blessing to be given. And for Christians in those days, it was not only that issue, it was also the issue of whether one renounces Christ or not. And chapter 13 is a very interesting chapter in this context, where we have in this context a man who renounces Christ. In chapter 13, there's the projection Jesus is saying about the future. When you see these things happening, don't go off saying this man's the Christ or that man's the Christ. Don't go down the route of following some nationalistic cause. It's not true. And stay close, because there'll be people will betray you and you'll betray others, and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of real problems and persecution and tension. So if we imagine this story being written at the time when these things were actually happening, it really casts a really dark feel over this story, because for me, Mark may be saying to the listeners of this story, time to stand fast, not to give in. It's time not to renounce Christ. And many Christians would have done that. They would have actually literally renounced the name of Christ. That would have been their choice. Do we drop a bit of incense in honor of the emperor, and in so doing renounce Christ? Or do we actually say, I am a Christian and I believe in him, and suffer death, immediate death? That's a choice. I think that is really a somber note, but it's worth mentioning, because these guys, this was
it's contemporary. It makes me think of, we are incredibly privileged in Emmaus Road Church to have a lot of Iranians, because one of the primary ministries serving the Iranian church is Iran. The leaders are based in our church.
Yeah.
And so often, sort of the front couple of rows in one of our congregations will be people who can't go home. Most have been in prison. To be a Christian is to have no social advancement, and they paid an unspeakable price for their faith. And it's very easy to sit in Surrey and think, well, those poor old, early church people. But you suddenly look out and think, this is today. I mean, Iran is the only caliphate on earth. It's what ISIS were trying to establish, and it's not working. I mean, and the Iranian church is the fastest growing church in the world today. So these are extraordinary people. But let me ask you a question then. I mean, Stefan, you're writing a gospel to try and encourage a church under persecution to stand firm and not to renounce your faith. You take, Peter, the first pope, the leader of the church, and you at some length tell a story about him renouncing his faith when it counted. Yeah. Why would you do that? I mean, if there's ever a story you want to hush up, it's this one.
Yeah. I honestly, I would love to say I know the answer to that. I don't. But I think, as I said earlier, the contrast between Peter and Jesus is the one I think we're meant to notice. That Jesus is our example. And the passage, the gospel talks always about following him down the road. The way that he asks us to follow is ultimately to accept the possibility that we're meant to die. And so Jesus comes across as the hero. And if you like, I agree with all we've said about Peter being in some way a sympathetic character. But that's absolutely right. But at the same time, that's the antithesis of Jesus here at this point. And this is the encouragement. This is the hard encouragement of Mark's gospel, actually. And even in our cozy, in your case, Surrey, in my case, Southampton, in our cozy environments where we're not facing that choice specifically, nevertheless, that call to deny ourselves constantly, to go to the cross, rather than serve our own whims, our own selfish needs, which is so often a temptation, is with us day in, day out. And for some of us, that cross will mean actual suffering of one kind or another, not necessarily persecution. But it's about, do we, at the time of taking on these sufferings and these difficulties and this self-renunciation, does that in fact say something about our love of Christ? Or are we going to go back? Are we going to go back to the ways we had in the past, where our thoughts are focused on us? And I think that's the challenge, I think, even for us 21st century Christians in the West.
It certainly is.
I think we need to talk a little bit about some of the questions that have come from our listeners. I think you were talking about one of them earlier on, weren't you, that grabbed your attention? The one that grabbed my attention was about the crow, the crow. I think David wanted to say that there's obviously in Mark what we've learned as we've gone through this podcast series is that Mark never mentions details for no reason. They're often details, and it just got me thinking about the rooster. And of course, there is a rooster earlier on in chapter 13, where right at the end, Jesus is talking to Peter, actually, and Andrew and James and John on the Mount of Olives, and he says, "Watch, for the owner of the house is going to go away, but watch, and he may come back at any time, whether it's at midnight, whether it's at evening, when the rooster crows, or when it's at dawn. Anytime, be aware, watch, And for many people, that's Jesus talking about the second coming. But for me, I think it's talking about this passage, that if we take chapter 13 as being not about the second coming necessarily, but more about the climax of this story, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. These incidents that are actually happening now in chapter 14 have been prophesied by Jesus, because the Son of Man will be coming back. The Son of Man will be coming back to be crucified. What are you going to do at those moments of crisis? Watch. And of course, that's what he asks Peter to do in the Garden of Gethsemane as well, which he simply doesn't do. So there's all these ties between these chapters which make me feel, wow, what an impressive tapestry of complex ideas Mark's Gospel really.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that's right. And pastorally, touching on your earlier point, it's a really clever thing to do, because it means that every time, wherever they are in the Roman Empire, every time someone hears this gospel, and then later that day, that week, that month, hears, a rooster crow, you're taken back to this moment. It's a very powerful teaching device. I wrote a book called Red Moon Rising, and it doesn't happen very often, but whenever a big old red moon rises and they report it in the news, I have people around the world saying, "Oh, yeah, I've seen a red moon rise." That must have happened. The sound of the cock crowing was a hyperlink back to this moment. But I love that. I'm sure you're right that parallel is deliberate. That's powerful. I've not seen that before.
Is there anything else from the passage, or maybe one or two of the questions that you'd like to focus on, Pete?
Yeah, I was fascinated by something that Matt Dunlop asked online. He drew a connection between this story and Mark chapter 9, which you may remember is the disciples, trying to cast out the demon. Jesus has been up the Mount of Transfiguration, comes back, and it hasn't worked. Jesus then has to bail them out, and it's that story. And he says that this kind can come out only by prayer. And then straight afterwards, there's this moment where the disciples are all hot under the collar because they found someone casting out demons in Jesus' name, and they use this same phrase, "He's not one of us." So there's this phrase that's echoing here of, are you one of Jesus's? Is someone not one of Jesus? And here Peter opts out and says, "I am not one of them." And all I can say is Matt, that's such a fascinating point. And I'm sure that the issues of identity and belonging are key, both in this gospel and for the church it's been written for, where people are having to decide, am I in at enormous price, or am I out? But, as I've said throughout, Stefan, you've studied these things in greater depth than all of us. What would you say about that link between Mark 9 and this story?
I think that's absolutely right, that this idea of being with Christ or not with Christ, the man who was chosen to be with him at the beginning in chapter 3, to be with him and to go out and to preach and to cast out demons, he's the man who now says, "I'm not with him." And it's extraordinary, isn't it? What a huge reversal.
Yeah,
absolutely. I love what you say about identity and belonging as well, how that relates to us. That's fantastic. Pete, it's wonderful. It's been a great conversation. I wish we had time to carry on, but time has eluded us, I'm afraid. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I'm sure our listeners are going to have a treat when they finally listen to this podcast. So bless you. I just want to mention that this is the 61st episode of Question Mark. So please, if you are listening, do tell your friends about this and comment if you liked it. I would love to hear from you. So until next time, it's goodbye from Pete Greig.
Goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.